we are going to have a presentation from Claire O'Neill paying tribute to Simon Crean. Claire.
Thank you, delegates. Simon Crean was a giant of the Labor Party. He was an icon of our movement. He was integral to almost everything that happened in Australian politics and industrial relations over a period of more than 40 years. He served as president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. He was the only person to serve as a cabinet minister across the Hawke, Keating, Rudd and Gillard governments. He was central to some of the proudest reforms that we have made as a Labor Party, the Accord, the creation of superannuation and of Medicare. He was a reformer, a thinker, a doer, a negotiator, a person who brought a good heart and a good mind to every task. And he was my mentor and my friend, as he was to so many of us in this room. Simon served 23 years as the member for Hotham, and in the suburbs of southeast Melbourne, he is worshipped as a hero. His name is on a hall in almost every single one of Hotham's schools. It is on plaques and parks and public buildings. But it's not the investment and the dollars that people remember. Everywhere I go, my constituents have a story for me about Simon Crean, about how he respected them, how he listened to them, about how no matter how high he flew in politics, he treated everyone he met as his equal. He was egalitarian to his core, equally at home on the factory floor or in the boardroom, speaking to a pensioner in Clayton as speaking to Australia's Prime Minister. To Simon, everyone mattered and everyone's opinion mattered, and my constituents knew that because you could feel it when you talked to him. He was a politician of the old school. Simon had a very long history of supporting Labor women. It's thankfully really common in our party today to see mentoring and support for young women who are coming up through the ranks. But when Simon joined the union movement, the world of Labor politics was blokey and women were shut out of leadership positions. Our party needed to change, and we did change because of the strong, gutsy women who fought for change and the men who stood strong alongside them, and that was Simon Crean. Simon helped me tremendously in my life in politics, and I saw him do this for so many other Labor women, and for that I'll always be grateful. Much has been said about Simon's decision to lead Labor to oppose the war in Iraq, and it is really hard to remember how truly countercultural that was to the politics of the moment. It was politically almost unthinkable what he did. It was gutsy and honest, and it was true, and it was right. Those principles that saw Simon oppose the war in Iraq didn't surprise anyone to those who knew him well, because that was how Simon lived every day of his life in politics, with courage, by his principles. What mattered to Simon wasn't what was popular, it was what was right, and there is probably no truer definition of leadership than that. After everything Simon achieved in politics, what actually mattered most to him was his family. Politics and the work that we all do in this room can be very hard on a marriage, but you would never know that looking at Simon and Carol Crean. They met as teenagers and they were just as much in love 50 years later. Simon Crean lived a worthy life of intense meaning in so many ways. He was Labor to his core, a person who will be outlived by the millions of Australians whose lives he helped to change through politics and through the union movement. And at the end of the day, that's why we're all here. Simon, we'll miss you terribly.
Simon Crean was a great Australian. Giant of the Labor movement is how our Prime Minister recently described him, and that indeed he was. Labor owes a lot to Simon Crean because Simon laboured hard for all Australian workers. From his time at the Storemen and Packers Union to his presidency at the ACTU, Simon was part of a new generation of union leaders who dedicated their days and countless nights to improving living standards for working people.
This was a man that cared about people, cared about fairness, cared about justice.
At the ACTU, Simon played a key role in the accord that made our economy stronger and our society fairer, and helped deliver some of Labor's proudest achievements, including Medicare and universal superannuation. But it was his political life that really ensured his place in Australian history.
Simon Crean, how are you?
He represented the people of Hotham with a passion and dedication that would not be thwarted. And ultimately, the whole country would reap the benefit of that fervour. Bob Hawke knew what he had in Simon Crean, so he brought him straight into the ministry, where he served as one of the Prime Minister's closest allies. And he continued to serve in the cabinets of 4 Labor Prime Ministers across his political career. His dedicated service in the ministries of primary industries, employment, education and training, trade, regional Australia and the arts, to name a few, made him a huge contributor to the Australian way of life. His leadership of the party in opposition was exemplary in the way he represented the voices of the Australian people and held the coalition government of the day to constant account.
And he understood that this country works best when we bring people together.
But it was the way he stood up to the president of another country in his unswayable opposition to the Iraq War.
This war is wrong. Australia should not be in it.
An opposition that was vindicated, that was one of Simon's most memorable contributions. He was a man of principle. As Prime Minister Albanese put it, above all, he was a thoroughly decent human being who was kind, generous and always of good humour. This brought him respect across the political spectrum.
He was always focused on helping particularly working Australians, but serving the national interest. Simon will also be remembered for just the joy that he brought to people.
And so we say farewell and thank you to not just a giant of the Labor movement and the Labor Party.
He's one of my Labor heroes and a person in whose footsteps I'm very proud to walk.
But a giant of humanity. For it was truly his humanity that made him and those around him
I'll miss you.
really stand tall.
I'll miss you. Thanks.
Thank you, delegates.